Wel, prynhawn da. Mae'n braf gweld y neuadd yma yn llawn. Dyn ni hefyd, dwi'n gwybod, yn recordio, a fydd y ddarlith i'w gweld ar y we, a mae cyfle i ni ddathlu gyda'n gilydd dydd Gwildewi yma yn y Brifysgol. A very, very warm welcome to you. It's great to see so many here for a key event, the annual St. David's Day Lecture. We could focus so much on the issues of St. David's of the past, but one of the key issues of the life of St. David, certainly within the Rhygyfarch volume, was on issues of sustainability and on future-proofing. And I'm delighted that Sir Jonathon has decided to deliver the lecture for us. Croeso cynnes iawn i chi. Sustainability and securing a sustainable future is mission critical to this university. A university that has historic roots, but is a university that is focused on the future and on securing a future in Wales and on a national stage. Today, as we remember Dewi, we look forward. We ask some key questions about sustainability, and we look forward to celebrate some of the key issues relating to this very important subject, which is central to the work of this university. I'm delighted now to call upon Dr. Jane Davidson, the director of Inspire. I'm indebted to her for the leadership and the vision that she has shown over the last 12 months in developing and promoting the activities associated with this key theme. Jane.
Well, good afternoon to you all. Prynhawn dda I chi gyd. And to borrow somebody else's quote, and it's a very good afternoon here in Trinity St. David, because not all of you in this room will be aware, but on Wednesday night, the chair of our strategy committee, another member of our strategy committee, the president of the Students' Union, the vice-chancellor and myself went to London. And we went to London to the first Guardian Higher Education Awards. And I'm delighted to tell you all that Trinity St. David won the first Guardian Higher Education Award for the best sustainability project in the whole of the United Kingdom. And I just wanted to say that at the beginning because there are a lot of people in this room I want to thank. I want to thank all those who contributed towards this agenda. I want to thank in particular the Vice-Chancellor, I want to thank the governors, and I want to thank the student body as well as the staff in terms of taking this forward. And at the end of this event, we'll hear from Matthias, our president of our Students' Union. But I just want, in introducing Jonathon, to say a little bit about how we are taking this agenda forward at this university. You've heard the Vice-Chancellor say that this agenda is mission critical. We all have a duty, when we're educators, to ensure that what we teach those whom we teach is as relevant as possible to the world that they're going out in. And the difficulty for people who are going out into a world now, as opposed to the degree I undertook some 30-odd years ago, is the world is a much less certain place. So we need to teach a different kind of skills. We need to teach skills for resilience. We need to ensure that our students of the future are able to critically solve problems and that they understand the kinds of challenges that are going to be facing them and future generations. And this university, as it's gone through a range of incarnations, and many of you here in this room will be aware that as little a time ago as a year ago, when I was launching Inspire, we had a university made up of the Lampeter and Carmarthen campuses, whereas now we are a university made up of Lampeter and Carmarthen and Swansea and Cardiff and London. And we're going into partnership, and I'm delighted to see representatives as well of the colleges, Coleg Sir Gar and Coleg Ceredigion. And that's all part of a big mission about ensuring that what we together can do is offer the best kind of educational offer, not just here in this part of Wales, but also through what we do internationally to as anybody in the world, to as wide a group of people as possible. So putting sustainability, putting employability, putting internationalisation, putting culture, our strong support for a bilingual agenda, a heritage agenda, an art and craft agenda, and putting lifelong learning at the heart of what we do will enable us to create a better offer for the future. And the partnerships we've been creating over the last year have reflected that. Partnerships with the councils, being part of the strategic bodies, the local service boards for Carmarthenshire and for Ceredigion, partnerships with the Prince's Charities looking at developing Strata Florida into a major university flagship initiative, partnership with Hywel Dda over a particular project with Aberystwyth University, over a chair, or in our case, a reader of rural health and community well-being, to start looking at if we can be more innovative about the way in which we take forward the health agenda, rather than traditionally looking at responding to the sickness agenda. And then in terms of our specific role in the context of Inspire, the virtual institute that works across the whole university, partnership with Vocalise, a local entrepreneur who is here today, Peter Anderson, has developed this exciting web platform on which both students and staff can put up ideas. So if you look at our website, you will see rolling constantly a set of ideas that are then ranked in terms of their importance to those who look at the site. And through Vocalise, we held our first competition in terms of looking at what, if we gave a small amount of money to the students on the sites on Carmarthen and Lampeter initially, what they might do with it. And if you come back here in June, there'll be a wildflower meadow, because the student who proposed the wildflower meadow won the support of others. And on the Carmarthen campus, there will be a bike shelter, as there will be bike shelters on other of our campuses, because we've just also launched our Cycle to Work scheme. And because we believe that this agenda should be fun, as well as making sure that we build those skills for employability, build those skills in terms of lifelong learning, change habits and behaviour. We are also funding 9 internships of £1,000 apiece for students, 3 on each of our campuses, Lampeter, Carmarthen and Swansea, where the students will be encouraged to develop our sustainability exchanges, our staff-student interface, encouraged to develop our fair trade agenda, and we're in Fair Trade Fortnight tonight, and those of you who are staying for dinner will have a wonderful fair trade meal, and also green impact. Green Impact, where our students are working with the National Union of Students over their specific initiative about how the students themselves can develop their impact. So in this last week, we have launched our Cycle to Work scheme. We have held our Fair Trade event with the chair in Carmarthen, with the chair of Carmarthenshire County Council, the mayor of Carmarthen, and 2 local schools. On Wednesday, we went down and to receive the Guardian Award. On Thursday, I became a mentor to the London College of Fashion. Please don't laugh, because my daughter did. But the London College of Fashion wants to institutionalise sustainability and wants to work with us on that delivery, but also made me an exciting offer, because they are a world-class institution, that our fashion students, wherever they are in Trinity St David, can work with the London College of Fashion on an exciting sustainability project as a result of that link. So this agenda is about enabling our students to have greater opportunities as well. And today, in the audience, scattered amongst you, are a number of academics and programme leaders from the Centre for Alternative Technology. A year ago, not long after we launched Inspire, we said that we and the Centre for Alternative Technology wanted to take our partnership to new heights. Last week, we agreed with the trustees that we would confirm that and take it forward, And academics from CAT have spent 3 days here, and this morning we held an incredibly exciting conference where academics from the current, TSD now includes Swansea Metropolitan, Lampeter and Carmarthen, and University of Wales academics as well, and CAT academics all came together. And they have a lot of very good ideas, Vice-Chancellor, so be warned. This agenda is at the beginning of its life here. But this is all about how we here in this very, very special part of Wales create an offer that is second to none. We bow to no one in our ambition that sustainability will drive the best agenda to ensure that our students are best placed for the future. And because that is our agenda, I wanted the person who probably, and he doesn't know this yet, probably inspired me most to come and join with us today. Now, Jonathon has only just told me that he has come back from Malaysia this morning in order to be with us this evening. And I hope that he's come back to be with us because he sees a university determined to take this agenda forward. I first met Jonathon in terms of his role as co-founder of Forum for the Future, an organisation which has done tremendous work with the public sector, including with local government in Wales, in terms of institutionalising sustainability, and was supported by the Welsh Government. Forum for the Future is now the UK's leading sustainable development charity with 70 staff, 100 partner organisations, including some of the world's leading companies, and Jonathon tells me they're just about to open in Delhi. He's also co-director of the Prince of Wales Business and Sustainability Programme, which runs seminars for senior executives around the world, a trustee for the Ashton Awards for Sustainable Energy, and works with many NGOs and charities as patron chair or special advisor. He was director of Friends of the Earth. He was co-chair of the Green Party, which he's still a member. He was chairman of UNED UK, chairman of Sustainability Southwest, the Southwest Roundtable for Sustainable Development, a trustee of WWF UK, and he and I sit on the WWF Global Ambassadors UK Council together, and was a member of the board of the Southwest Regional Development Agency. Interestingly enough, Jonathon, you've been member of at least 2 or 3 organisations that government has removed from. So obviously you were far too effective in that context. Because as minister in my previous role, I worked with Jonathon as the first chairman of the UK Sustainable Development Commission, which worked right across the UK in all political parties to provide expert advice to government on how to introduce and systematise sustainability. But Jonathon is now Chancellor of Keele University. When I established Inspire here, the following month, he took up that role as Chancellor of Keele University and is a visiting professor at Loughborough University. He has a number of books: Capitalism, As If the World Matters, Earthscan, Globalism and Regionalism, Black Dog, and Living Within Our Means, Forum for the Future. And he's working on a new book about how we get to be living in a sustainable world in 2050, and received a CBE over a decade ago now for services to environmental protection. I think we're very privileged to have Jonathon with us today, and I'm delighted that so many of you have made time this afternoon to hear one of the world's best advocates of what we should be doing to make sure we all have a better future. Ladies and gentlemen, Jonathon Porritt.
Jane, thank you very much indeed, and Vice-Chancellor, thank you for your invitation here this evening. It's my honour, to be honest, to be here on St. David's Day, to be invited to give this lecture, to have a chance to share with you some possibly quite controversial ideas about the role of higher education in promoting a more sustainable world, and to try and look out towards 2050 without necessarily collapsing in a miasma of gloom, which it is really quite easy to do. And as you heard from Jane, I've just come back from a visit to Malaysia, to Kuala Lumpur today. So I'm sitting there on the Heathrow Express thinking to myself, I wonder what cheery item there will be in the newspaper today. Obviously The Guardian. You'd expect me to conform to certain stereotypes. I don't like to be separated from The Guardian for more than a week, so I felt, right, excellent. Catch up with the latest in The Guardian. So what do I find? I find an article about the state of the world's pollinating insects. Now, as you probably know, there's a huge amount of concern around the world about the state of honeybees, which are at the moment in many different countries threatened by an extraordinary toxic combination of different diseases, of loss of habitat, and particularly now by the use of certain very poisonous insecticides, neonicotinoids as they're called, which have brought the honeybee in many countries to a dire state. So, the Guardian article tells me that we shouldn't really worry too much about the honeybee because it's fine in comparison to the rest of the world's pollinating insects that hardly get a look in the media, of course, because the honeybee is kind of closer to home and we all love the honeybee. The rest of these pollinating insects probably aren't quite so cuddly, if you know what I mean. The article, published in Science last week, tells us now that the rest of the world's pollinating insects are in certain respects even more endangered than the honeybee, that they are responsible for the pollination of about 3/4 of the world's crop, and that this is precipitating now a decline in yields that can already be measured in many countries all around the world. Thank you, Guardian. Got my morning off to a great start, as you can imagine. And then I began to speculate, so what do you think the response of the world will be to this new scientific data about the state of the world's pollinating insects? Because remember, without pollinating insects, there is a lot less pollination. Pollination is also done by bees and bats and other creatures, birds as well, but most of the pollination is done by these insects. And I think we know that the impact on the world's agriculture would be extraordinary if we see a decline in those pollinating insects. However, we live in a world now which seems to take all of this new scientific information about the state of the world as just so much froth going on in the background as we struggle to put right the economic damage of the last 5 years, or put right some of the problems that have been caused even further ago than that. And I bet you if you Googled any of these new scientific research reports to find what the level of interest would be, you would be mightily disappointed. I heard Al Gore give a lecture just a couple of months ago in which he indicated his apprehension at what he called the new normal. And by the new normal, he simply meant we internalize this stuff. We read it, we sort of go, oh, tut, tut. There's another slightly worrying indicator of global ecological decline, and we move on. We go straight back to living our lives in exactly the same way that we were living them before we encountered this unfortunate, very inconvenient data set. Nowhere is that more true than when we look at the science of climate change today. Last year, 2012, was an extraordinarily disturbing year for climate scientists. And anyone involved in that field of research will know that the mood amongst climate scientists today, amongst climatologists, is one of extreme concern at the difficulty that they are having in getting this now voluminous body of research properly understood and accepted, let alone acted on, by our politicians today. And last year, in 2012, with the research in the Arctic and the Antarctic, we began to see exactly what is going on out there in very stark terms. Al Gore went on to describe this through what he called the Lexicon of climate change. And as he said, when he started, a few years ago, to get interested in climate change, the language which was used indicated that the impacts on humankind, on civilization, would be grave. A little time on from that, people began to talk about the damage being very grave. Then scientists began to talk about the threats of what is now known as runaway climate change. And at the end of this lexicon, grave, very grave, runaway, we have irreversible climate change. Now, probably not irreversible if you're prepared to think in terms of eons, but irreversible in terms of any relevance to humankind, as in tens of thousands of years of a new disrupted climatic state, which would certainly put at risk civilization as we know it today. This is the continuum that we're gradually moving along. And although scientists try their hardest to bring our progression along that continuum to the attention of politicians, it is barely noticed by those politicians today. So where are we? Grave, very grave, runaway, irreversible. Well, the consensus amongst most climate scientists today is that we're somewhere between very grave and runaway. And runaway means that it'll start to get very bad really quite quickly. We may be able to put the horse, the bolted horse of climate change, back in the stable, but boy, will it be difficult at that stage to stop it going to irreversible. And when we're looking at irreversible, we're probably talking about something like average temperature increases between now and the end of the century of around 4.5 degrees centigrade. This is inconceivable in terms of the impact on humankind. Even the World Bank, in its latest report, described this likely scenario, a likely scenario, which would, I quote from the World Bank, not Friends of the Earth or Greenpeace, okay, this is the World Bank, unleash a cascade of cataclysmic change in economies all around the world. Now, there may be some in this audience who still prefer to listen to the wise words of Nigel Lawson or Jeremy Clarkson or other climate change experts of that kind, but I can assure you that the vast body of science today would confirm or endorse what I have just said to you now. So, the implication of this is pretty astonishing. And it takes climate change out of a long list of environmental problems that we face today and takes it into a category where it stands quite uniquely now as constituting an existential threat to humankind. And by existential, the scientists mean a threat which could completely destabilize human civilization as a whole, and indeed, if we get to irreversible out here, bring us to a completely different state that we can barely begin to imagine. Now, when I was at university, the only existential threat to the well-being of humankind was the Cold War, the standoff between the West and the East in terms of the potential exchange of nuclear weapons to pursue certain geopolitical purposes. MAD, it was called, mutually assured destruction. The existential threat of nuclear weapons has receded somewhat because we no longer have a geopolitical standoff between the East and the West, but has certainly been replaced by the climate change threat that I'm talking about today. That's my starting point. But as Jane mentioned, I'm in the throes of finishing off a book about 2050 with the brave and possibly preposterous notion that we do, in fact, succeed in getting to the point where we can claim to be living a sustainable life in 2050, in 35, 40 years' time. And what makes me so hopeful, not optimistic, I think optimism is a dangerous and rather shallow emotional state today, but what makes me hopeful about this is the sheer pace of change in the technologies that we're looking at today, and the growing awareness amongst large numbers of people outside the established political classes that we need a completely different quality of political leadership than what we're getting today. The technology story, I won't bore you with the details of this evening, because I'm hoping that we'll have plenty of time for a lively discussion about this. But the technology story is astonishing. If you look into the pipeline of what is now becoming available to us in terms of energy technologies, renewables, storage, new grids, new ways of thinking about energy networks, what Jeremy Rifkin has described as the energy internet, an opportunity to start thinking about energy in a completely different way. If you look at any of these technologies and the potential benefits they will bring to humankind, it's quite astonishing. It's difficult not to be really very excited. And I am not a person who has spent my entire life getting excited about technology. I've often been very suspicious of technology enthusiasts on the ground that technology enthusiasm can easily fall over the edge into a sort of mad techno-fixing escapism. And those of you who are here from CAT, from the Centre for Alternative Technology, will know full well the difference between realistic promotion of viable technologies for a sustainable world and mad, overzealous techno-fixing from the likes of those who can't actually confront the world as it really is. So I'm excited by my newfound enthusiasm for technology. I'm quite old now, I'm 62. It's a bit late in the day to be getting excited about technology, but actually it's giving me a bit of a kick. Were it not for the fact that not very much is happening to bring these technologies through the system, the financial and political system, as fast as we need them to come through. Our capital markets are still blinded by the desirability of short-term profit maximization. Our political classes are completely incapable of framing markets to promote renewable, sustainable energy futures, and continue to believe somehow that we can both vaguely promote renewable energy and continue to build new gas-fired power stations, or coal-fired power stations even, or, God help us, new nuclear power stations. This is an extraordinary state of affairs. This government, our current government, perfectly represents this insane dualism. With, on the one hand, a high level of rhetoric about the importance of renewable energy, and on the other hand, a new gas strategy and an energy bill going through Parliament at the moment, which will almost certainly entail the building of relatively large numbers of new gas-fired power stations. This is a government that can hold both those truths in its collective mind at the same time. No sane person should really be encouraged to try and do this. So, I would be more excited about the technology were it not for the state of our political classes today. I suspect that the transition we're talking about now, from a world almost entirely dependent on fossil fuels, to a world which will need to be 100% dependent on renewable energy, solar power and so on, a bit of geothermal thrown in for good measure, that transition would be pretty difficult at any point in human history. Right now, it looks massively problematic, partly because our politicians are wrestling with the legacy of having made such a mess of things over the last 40 or 50 years in terms of the increase in indebtedness and so on, and partly, and this is where I'm about to get on to higher education, you'll be happy to know Jane, partly because most of those politicians who are struggling with this state of awareness, this emerging crisis in our lives, are, not to put too fine a point upon it, sustainability illiterates. By which I mean they don't actually have the conceptual mindset to understand the nature of the crisis that we now face. Witness how easily politicians still characterize climate change as an environmental issue. Here we have the biggest existential threat to the future of human civilization, characterized effortlessly by politicians as an environmental issue. One issue in a long list of other environmental issues. Climate change is not an environmental issue. It is everything but an environmental issue. It is economic, it is to do with social justice, it's a philosophical issue. Some might argue it is a spiritual issue in terms of the grotesque dereliction that we are now guilty of in the way in which we look after this earth. To call it an environmental issue is to confirm that actually you haven't really begun to understand why climate change is so different from everything else. So a combination of this legacy of building up debts to fuel unsustainable economic consumption on the one hand, and chronic ecological sustainability illiteracy on the other hand, that is pretty devastating. Which brings me on to higher education. This has to be where the other source of hopefulness is to be found. Technology on its own is unlikely to do what we need it to do unless those who are taking responsibility for deploying that whole suite of technologies understand the need to transform our society in every other way. Now, not to be too apocalyptic about it, higher education is the place where this has to be confronted. I'm sorry to have to tell you that children in school today will never have a chance to shape the destiny of humankind. Because by the time they come to be adults in higher education, we will either have done what we needed to do in the intervening years, the 10, 15, 20 years, or we will not have done it. If we have done it, those young people in schools today can be part of a journey that takes us towards a sustainable world in 2050 and beyond. If we haven't done what we need to do in 10, 15, 20 years, it frankly will not be available to that younger generation in school today to do anything about it whatsoever. That's pretty startling. That's pretty startling. So we have to look at what that means for higher education today. I'm just so delighted to be here today to celebrate with all of you this wonderful award. This is fantastic. To celebrate with all of you the work that's already been going on for slightly more than a year since Jane took over Inspire. To celebrate the ambitions now of Trinity St. David in terms of what it's seeking to do around the whole wider sustainability agenda. For me, when I'm looking at this stuff very carefully these days, I love the fact that this university now has a formal commitment to ensure, I better get this right, Jane, just in case the Vice-Chancellor ticks me off later, that there will be a 15% sustainability experience in all undergraduate student experiences. Now, that may sound really dry and boring, that there should be a 15% sustainability ingredient in every undergraduate experience. Now, for those not involved in HE, you probably don't know how revolutionary that is. Because in order to set that target and make that commitment, this university has had to negotiate with all of the power brokers in all of the different departments and the deans and the faculty heads and every other academic from one campus to the next, and I lose count of how many campuses there are now. This university has had to negotiate with every single one of them that they will share in that collective ambition to ensure that the curriculum fully reflects the materiality, the centrality of sustainability to the lives of the students that they are responsible for. And that, I suspect, with your Vice-Chancellor and Jane, is only the start of this. I think the proposed or the forthcoming mergers with the FE colleges is really important because, like me, Jane puts employability absolutely at the heart of sustainability. We have to bring these social and economic issues into the heart of sustainability. It's one way to stop people talking about climate change as an environmental issue. It's not the only way, but it's one way. So this is hugely exciting. There on the horizon, in 5-10 years' time, is the prospect that every single graduate from this university will be a sustainability literate graduate. This is a big ambition. And I'm speaking now as Chancellor of Kiel University. And I know how big an ambition it is because I couldn't stand on a podium like this at my own university and make that claim. Not yet. I have been appointed as what was described as an activist chancellor, which scares the life, of course, out of all vice-chancellors, as you can imagine. But I really don't suppose Kiel appointed me if they thought that my principal purpose in life would be to don the chancellor's bling and perform at ceremonies year in, year out. There is a job to be done. And Kiel is well down that path. Kiel has shown fantastic leadership on many aspects of sustainability, and I think Jane would bear out here that we have a small cohort of universities now across the UK which are so keen to learn from each other. The Higher Education Academy has been promoting this shared learning process to ensure that leadership in one part of the HE world can be picked up, replicated, and made effective in the shortest possible period of time. Because frankly, if Trinity St. David is the only university graduating every student as a sustainability literate graduate in 5 years' time, we are in a frightful mess. I say that with some feeling because as chair of the Sustainable Development Commission, I had to wrestle day in, day out with the complexity of trying to advise politicians for whom the receiving medium, namely their brain, was so incapable of absorbing basic messages about sustainability that even with the best will in the world, and actually a lot of them were really fantastically nice people, particularly in Wales, obviously, with Jane, as you can imagine, fantastically nice and well-intentioned, but there was something going on at the back of the brain that said, how does this help us do what we've got to do in terms of all the things that we're committed doing, like higher levels of economic growth, for instance? After 9 years of doing that, I was worn down. And I sort of needed a thought that somehow our future politicians will have a receiving medium, as in what is going on at the back of their brain, that can actually cope with this stuff. So my final thought is this. If you accept the analysis of science today, you should accept that climate change constitutes a unique existential threat to the future of humankind. There is nothing else in that category. A unique existential threat to the future of humankind. Everybody involved in HE has to then think, what is their moral responsibility in enabling young people today to grapple with that existential threat? Is it enough that universities should put the way of their students certain stuff about climate science, that they should get involved in a few sort of turn-off campaigns? You know, these are relatively easy, and I commend all student unions that do fantastic work to persuade students to turn off their lights. This is pretty difficult, by the way, as you probably understand, but nonetheless. Is it enough that students today should almost by accident stumble across the reality of the world into which we are ineluctably heading if we don't do something very different, speedily and at scale? An existential threat poses the issue of disproportionate responsibility for this generation of educators in terms of what they owe the next generation as those who are being educated about the state of the world as it will be, not the state of the world as we would like it to be. As Jane said, in thinking of the why this university has already been able to achieve so much in terms of the Guardian Award, to make this teaching as relevant as possible to the real world. not as relevant as possible to a world that is actually disappearing rapidly behind us. Now, this is not so easy in universities, in higher education. All universities have an absolutely clear commitment to academic freedom, to ensuring that their universities are places of learning and not places of indoctrination. That they are places where young people are able to discover for themselves what is happening in the world today. But frankly, and this is the controversial bit, it is far too late to leave this to chance. It is utterly immoral that any single young person should leave any university in the world today without understanding the full extent of what climate change means to their future. Utterly unacceptable. Morally unacceptable. And that poses an extremely difficult responsibility on universities, which is to say that given the scale of this threat, we have to rethink how we do our teaching and our mentoring about climate change. And for me, talking to my colleagues at Keele, this has become a really interesting, philosophical, political conundrum. Because there am I saying that I think it should now be absolutely compulsory that every single student at Keele and every university should have access to the latest science about climate change and should be enabled through ongoing discussion to understand the implications of climate change to their own future. I also happen to believe, perhaps wishfully, that every single member of staff should have access to that same set of scientific insights about the state of the world today. It seems a bit unfair to suggest that undergraduates should have to go through this process, whereas staff, both academic and non-academic, are somehow immune from that obligation. Now, this is not easy. Universities do not usually acknowledge the need to make that kind of approach to learning, to teaching, obligatory, compulsory, rather than leave it to students and teachers to make it available in some other ways. That's a really big challenge for all of us. I'm not sure how long it'll take HE in the UK to arrive at this shared understanding. I have to tell you that not many people in HE today would probably subscribe to the view that I have just laid out in front of you, although I suspect that maybe here at Trinity St. David, you've pushed a little bit closer to that, not the compulsory bit, but the bit about doing it in the right kind of way that many universities have. For me, this is our obligation now. This is our moral duty, that we have to enable people to understand what is happening in the world and interpret our responsibilities in that world differently from the way we've interpreted them up until now. Otherwise, my somewhat rosy prospect for a genuinely sustainable world for 8.6 billion people in 2050, I haven't talked about population this evening, but rest assured that's rather fewer people than most people imagine we'll have. A genuinely sustainable world for 8.6 billion people in 2050 will just disappear in a kind of fog of confusion, political procrastination, and our inability to seize hold of the real truth of the world as it is today. Thank you, Jane, for inviting me. I hope that this will at least stimulate a little bit of discussion about what HE should now be doing in this context, and of course discussion about anything else you care to chuck at me, even if it is wind farms in this part of Wales. Thank you. Well, if you want to, yes, okay.
Thank you, Jonathan, for that hugely interesting and challenging speech. And all speeches should be challenging, because if we're going to create creative thinkers and creative problem solvers for the future, we have to have where we are challenged on a regular basis. And I was interested that a couple of weeks ago I was invited to be on a radio programme, the Science Cafe, run by BBC Radio Wales. And I was asked to discuss a book called The Geek Manifesto. And some of you may be aware of this. The author, Mark Henderson, is an environmental correspondent for the Times newspaper. But part of Mark's thesis was that what scientists do is evidence-based policy, and what politicians do is policy-based evidence. And until politicians do evidence-based policy, we will not be able to get the benefit of that intellectual capital that we have in our universities, the length and breadth of Wales, of the UK and the world, and really intervene and change what politicians do. I leave that thought with you, and I now hand you over to Jonathon, and please comment, ask questions, challenge, because that's what we want to do here this evening. And we're on film, and I'm delighted that at the back of the hall we have a young man from Hobart College in New York, who is my intern, who is filming this so that we can actually share the experience with others through the Inspire pages on the website. So, ladies and gentlemen, over to you.
Thank you, Jane. Now, you've thrown me at their mercy, and of course I have no idea who any of you are. I was always told, of course, that all Q&A sessions never take the first hand that goes up, because it used usually, back in the 70s and 80s, to belong to representatives of the Socialist Workers' Party. Assuming there aren't many of them left anyway, and certainly not here in this part of Wales, I'm prepared to take the first hand wherever it comes from. Thank you. I think you have to shout, don't you? Because I don't see roving microphones, so I think it may be stand up and project. That would be wonderful. Thank you so much.
I'm on side. Just to preface what I'm going to say with, I am on side.
But
Higher education is in an economic bind at the moment, and we need to attract students. So when part of the degree that they're paying for is in a subject they think they don't want to learn about, we've got a problem. So if we embed in our curriculum 20 credits of their degree on sustainability issues, the feedback that we've had so far is I don't want to learn about sustainability. So either we hide it and disguise it in some way, or we've got some other kind of issue. And I'm not saying this to be inflammatory, I'm saying this because this is a genuine kind of concern. Education is something they're buying now. They're getting debt, horribly in debt, and they're thinking of it in economic terms. And it's a product that we're selling. So it's become bleh. Because I don't have another word. Sorry, can you hear me? Yeah, excellent.
okay, so
So there's my point, really.
yes, and what a good point. You've got the language right, of course, about what higher education is now required to do by government. Personally, I despise this language, and I think that the direction in which we're currently traveling, in which higher education becomes a commodity or a product to be sold to young people at their expense so they can build debt on day one of their post-university lives, is truly horrendous. And the whole language associated with marketization of higher education and learning is something that makes me recoil. But you have accurately captured what is happening in terms of this great sector. So what can I say to that? Okay, so my hunch here is it may be what you called a problem now. I would call it a challenge rather than a problem. It may be that Trinity St. David hasn't yet been able to think through ways in which it will market the desirability of coming to a university which is uniquely focused on the real world rather than on some fantasia out there in their future. focused on employability as well as sustainability. This is very important. The employability league table now for students counts for at least as much as the pecking order league table of where universities are academically. And my own feeling is that as the reality of climate change impacts more and more forcefully on the lives of young people, it will become less and less strange to be invited to come to a university which differentiates itself partly because it is emphatic in its commitment to sustainability. That has to be the judgment that your Council and Senate have made. This is a big commitment. This is why I singled this out. It's a big commitment. It is genuinely differentiating. And whatever else you might say about the marketization of higher education, the idea of universities moving towards a different way of making themselves available to young people, with a different sort of philosophical base, with a different mission and purpose and a different set of things that they think are critical. I like that idea. I like the idea of differentiation in HE because I think that will be good for the sector. Just not sure about the way in which it's being done. So for me, I suspect this is a timing issue. It may look frightening and possibly deterring to young people today to be invited to have 15% of their input, which will take many different shapes and sizes, by the way. It won't all be propagandizing lectures from people like me. A lot of it will be much more subtle and, of course, much more helpful to them in their career. And you can imagine how climate change creeps into practically every part of the academic curriculum really quite easily. I was a teacher for 10 years back in the 1970s, and very early days, obviously, in terms of all this stuff. I had very little difficulty as a teacher of English and drama infiltrating green propaganda into the lives of my students for the best part of 10 years. So far as I know, it didn't do them any harm. I think possibly they had quite a good time. But it seems to me that's, I'm not suggesting subversive infiltration is the best route. Please don't get me wrong. Don't have to do it that way these days. But I think it's going to become a plus, not a minus. That's the judgment you're making. Now, that's a tough call. I'm not underestimating this. I am truly not underestimating this, which is why I singled that out, because lots of universities are going to do the sustainability thing in all sorts of different ways. Curriculum, that's the sticky bit. That's the sticky bit. So, yeah, get good at marketing, see what happens. The world's moving in this direction, so who knows? Well,
there is a microphone coming round.
So I can answer that one very quickly, and then there's a hand in the second row there, and then there's a hand in the back row there. But the next hand up was just there, Kunog, yes. So is it a generational thing? I used to hope that it was a generational thing, and then I got a bit older, and I kept saying it's another generational thing. Soon I'll be so old it'll be yet another generation. And you sort of think, how many times am I going to sort of hope rather forlornly that the next generation is going to come up and do it? It's very hard for young people today to actually emerge out of this peculiarly alienated culture in which they live, to see sustainability and environmental issues in any kind of rounded way. Their world is so full of just this permanent, endless bombardment about a consumer society, about ways in which they should see progress and what success means in their lives. So many young people now are completely detached from any understanding of how the natural world works, let alone any direct contact with it. So it's genuinely difficult for young people today, I think, to see for themselves right now what this all means. I watched the most brilliant YouTube film the other day about this 12-year-old in Germany who has set up an organization called Plant a Planet. And I'm only mentioning this because I think this is something that's quite close to this university in terms of the Size of Wales project and all of this stuff. This 12-year-old, honestly, I thought to myself, my God, if every single child was able to get one tiny, tiny slice of the early insights he's got into the workings of the world and the politicians in that world, this would be a revolution. This would be a revolution. So some young people are able to work their way through this horrendous, alienating culture, but it is hard. And from that perspective, I don't automatically put my hopes in the next generation because we still have to bring a different culture to bear on this. And the word culture comes up a lot in what Trinity and David is trying to do. It's interesting that we've all got used to the 3 C's of HE: community, curriculum, campus. Trinity and David adds a 4th one, which is culture. And it is quite important. I like the fact that that's in there, because it means we're thinking about the surrounding environment in which young people are being brought up. So no automatic assumptions the next generation are going to be any more equipped to do this naturally, but let's just hope we can make a difference while there's still time, as I said.
Can I say, first of all, Jonathan, thank you very much for an absolutely magnificent lecture. It was both profound, as I'd expect, but also moving, actually. So thank you very much for that. Can I ask you a question about gas, to get down to practicalities? I read recently, and it may have been in The Guardian, indeed, that Obama is intending to, and is in the process of extracting large quantities of shale gas and so on, and that this is part of the way in which he proposes to meet his climate change targets, his emissions targets, in order to, as part of his climate change strategy. And of course, we heard about the same kind of approach in Britain. So I'd like to ask you, generally, what do you think about Obama pursuing that? And secondly, what advice would you give us in Wales, working on the assumption that things are likely to move in that direction, both in the States and in the UK as a whole? In Wales, we are told, considerable resources, both of shale gas and of coal-based methane. What would you suggest we do about that, bearing in mind, too, that we have a disastrously low level of GDP in Wales, GVA, compared to the UK average, which makes us very, very dependent indeed on the UK Treasury?
Right. So, firstly, what would I do to advise President Obama? That would be a nice thing. So the story in the US is a complete nightmare. We just have to accept this. It is impossible to imagine how the world's most powerful economy has become a kind of complete basket case in terms of its understanding of and commitment to science as the basis of policy. We have problems here in the UK about that connection, evidence-based policy, as Jane described it. I can assure you, our problems are as nothing in comparison to America, which is not surprising, given that 45% of people in America sort of still believe that Darwin's theory of evolution really doesn't hold water. So you know you're kind of up against it when the backdrop to this, a Tea Party backdrop, is such a one as tells you that evolution, schmevolution. Against that backdrop, Obama is working hard to try and make sense of the fact he can't get anything through Congress. He can't get anything through Congress. Imagine a president who can't get anything through Congress. And from that perspective, he's decided to try and do his climate-related stuff everywhere outside of Congress. So, for instance, he's doing a lot about investment in renewable energy. We never hear about that in the UK. Actually, tens of billions of dollars have been invested in a lot of very smart technology. He's doing a lot through the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, by regulation. He's doing a lot through city mayors and state governors who are capable of bringing forward different climate-related measures. So he's doing a lot. But he's stuck in this hard place that he can't really drive renewables fast enough to bring forward those renewables at the scale that is now required. So, for better or worse, he's thrown in his lot with this wondrous new source of hydrocarbons, unconventional gas, fracking this unconventional gas, hydraulic fracturing of the resources down in these deposits, which we weren't able to reach up until about 15, 20 years ago, when the very smart, brilliant people in oil and gas companies learned how to do horizontal drilling and different kinds of extraction technologies, which now means that gas, and indeed the shale oil, is technically available to us when it wasn't before. So here's my very simple take on that. If the use of that gas kills the coal industry, that's a plus. That's a plus, because the coal industry is responsible for a far higher proportion of emissions than gas. If the use of that gas blocks investment in energy efficiency and renewables, that's a horrendous negative. And pretty much the same story applies here in the UK. We may need more gas to help bridge to this world where we have 50, 60, 70, and then eventually, in my opinion, quite soon actually, the possibility of 100% renewables, 95% renewables, call it what you will. And I know that there are people here from Centre for Alternative Technology whose vision of a zero-carbon Britain, if you don't believe what I've just said about a near 100% renewable Britain, read that report. It's a cracker. It's part of the great thought leadership of CAT, which we've all benefited from over the last 40 years or so. But if we suddenly stumble across gas, as George Osborne has, and thinks to himself he's got a way out of this miserable trap that he's caught in, then we are back in trouble. That's the problem. That's the problem. This gas could be a short-term benefit as a way of taking coal out of the energy mix. I know that's difficult in many parts of the world. And I know saying that in Wales still brings back really seriously painful memories about the ways in which this has been done. But we actually have to take coal out of the energy mix altogether as fast as we can. If gas can help us do that, good. If gas kills the prospects for investment in efficiency and renewables, that's a shocker.
You mentioned the importance of social justice as an underlying principle behind sustainable development. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that in depth, and that whether you realise that we've been working on a democratic platform for the United Kingdom that we're hoping to take to scale, that is underpinning all the work here at Inspire, that enables communities to self-organise, prioritise ideas and share those ideas across different communities. I was wondering what you might be able to do to help take that project to scale, as it's already, we've got proof of concept at Pembrokeshire College there, and it looks like it's going to be adopted here at Trinity St David's as well.
Okay, so I'm a sustainability activist because of my passion about social justice. I didn't really become a sustainability activist out of a conventional concern about, quotes, the environment. I started because I was teaching in a school in Shepherd's Bush in West London for 10 years, and my eyes were opened to the structural inequity in our society today. And since then, I fear it has got even worse. So I came into this world more because of my passion about social justice than because of my passion about the natural world, if I'm being honest. And it's only because, of course, now the threats have reached this existential state that I think everyone's realizing that you can't talk about social justice if you're not attending to these extraordinary challenges in our lives. It's impossible to talk about social justice in a world where we have runaway climate change. I mean, what does that mean? It's just, you know what will happen. It's the same old story. Those who have the money, the resources, the assets, the power, the influence, the ability to fix things will try and fix their way out of accelerating climate change, while those who have no money, no assets, no land, no power, no influence will be the people who get hit hardest by those impacts. That's the way of the world. So climate change is first and foremost a social justice issue, an economic issue about social justice. So against that backdrop, and I'm going to connect the two, social justice and dealing with climate change, you have to be excited about two things happening in the world today. Firstly, the phenomenal growth in small-scale community cooperative energy schemes. I'm very alert to what's happening in Germany. And for those who are a bit stuck on thinking about what community energy, small-scale community energy means, find out about what's going on in Germany. It is staggering. We have this absolute upsurge in small-scale community organizations grabbing hold of one bit of the sustainable energy agenda or another. I read recently of the growth of cooperatives in Berlin, which has now reached such a substantial level that they are hoping by the end of this year to put in a bid to take control of the entire grid serving citizens in Berlin. Can you imagine? Citizens of Berlin managing their own grid for their own citizens as a cooperative. So Germany, the most influential and successful economy in Europe, we have quite a lot to learn from them on many counts, is blazing a trail here, which is extraordinary to watch. And the second thing I would tell you is that the reason why I'm so passionate about some of these technologies today is that this is a leapfrog story for developing countries. Everything that you read today about changes around solar power, around biomass technologies in particular, around different uses for hydrology, different understandings of how water systems work, water-powered technologies, all of those things permit a leapfrogging for developing countries that wasn't available before. If you look at what's happening to PV, whatever you may think about China's role in the world economy today, just thank the Chinese for their incredible command and control drive to bring down the price of photovoltaic cells in the world today. It is staggering. Every year, the cost of PV, photovoltaics, comes down by about 7.5%. Every year. We are already down now to the point where in some countries, photovoltaics, particularly off-grid, so not connected into the grid, is competitive with any other source of energy. Pretty soon in those countries, especially those that can call on the sunshine a bit more than we can, pretty soon those countries will actually be at what is called grid parity. So every single unit of electricity coming off a solar-powered installation will bring that electricity to those homes, villages, factories, whatever it might be, at the same or a lower cost than a hydrocarbon source of energy, often kerosene, whatever it might be. This is amazing. In 10 years' time, maybe less, needing to connect up off-grid communities to a big central grid system will just be seen as laughable as it would be seen today to connect up rural Africa or rural Southeast Asia to a central telecommunications network. Who do you think is talking about that these days? Putting in a fixed line telecommunications system. That disappeared as a goal 5, possibly 10 years ago, as mobile telephony simply leapt over the idea that the only way to get better communications was to install fixed line and then you would graduate to mobile. That's not how it's working in the developing world. Fixed line, gone. There'll never be fixed line communication in many of these countries, and they won't miss it for a single second. Everything will go to mobile platforms. Everything is going to mobile platforms. In the same way, everything in the developing world will go to the kind of energy systems where you don't necessarily have to be connected to the grid, where you're not dependent on large-scale energy providers, where small-scale renewable systems provide those communities with everything, and I mean everything they need. That's social justice in practice. That's what these technologies can do.
The second part to that question, which was, did you realise that we've been working on a social project, a social justice project for the last 5 years, and that's underpinning the Inspire project? Right. And what can you do to help to take that to scale?
No, is the answer. I didn't realise. I'm sorry. So probably not very much, because it's best not to act in ignorance, as you know. Maybe if I was still chair of the Sustainable Development Commission, scaling, that was one of the things we talked about endlessly with Jane, is how do we do scaling? How do we get all these amazing projects and initiatives really moving at scale faster? And the Commission, whilst it still existed, was capable of doing a bit of that. But you're right, this is a huge institutional challenge to get scale of that kind moving much faster. So I'll find out about this. I've no doubt that by the end of this evening, I will be fully apprised of vocalize. Obviously, if I'm sitting next to Jane, obviously I will be. And I shall be very interested to hear about that. Thanks. So I think there are a couple of hands there. You'll tell me when we have to finish, won't you?
Back in 1978, I went to a talk with you, Jonathan, in a small town hall in Hertfordshire.
Right.
Sorry to wind it back.
Do you
a bit.
remember anything I said? Because if you do, I'm in trouble. But anyway,
I
okay.
do remember one thing that stuck with me for a long time, and at the time you were speaking as, I think, co-chair of the Ecology Party, as it was then, and you said the problem for many problems in the world why politicians don't act is so they'll always say, show me the dead bodies before they'll act. Yeah. And over those 35 years, I guess the dead bodies have begun to pile up, but the politicians still aren't acting. How many dead bodies do you think need to be shown to them before they will actually make the real action?
Wow. Your words come back to haunt you. So if I recall, 1978, okay, so the Secretary of State for the Environment at that time was a man called Nicholas Ridley. This name may resonate with some of you. And Nicholas Ridley was renowned for his utter contempt, both for the environment, as Secretary of State for the Environment, and most of all for environmentalists, who he loathed with a passion so profound you can hardly believe it. He, at that time, was very involved in the debate about the build-up of nitrates in water supplies. And there was growing concern about how nitrates were converting in the human body into nitrites, which are carcinogens, and concern particularly about a problem called Methemoglobinemia, which affects very young children, infants. And Friends of the Earth and the Green Party, Ecology Party, had a campaign going at that time. And believe it or believe it not, Nicholas Ridley said, when you can point to a pile of bodies that have died as a consequence of their ingestion or the build-up of nitrates in their nitrites in their body, we'll think about acting. I was so taken aback by this. It clearly stuck in my mind in 1978. The fact I can recall this horror story even now shows you how dreadful it was. Yes, pile of bodies policy making, slightly different from evidence-based policy making, but perhaps quite realistic in this day and age. I don't know the answer to that. I fear the pile, however inappropriate that analogy may be, will have to be very large indeed. And I fear even more that there is a disproportionality in the size of the pile between the rich developed world and the poor developing world. And we seem to find it easy to hear about devastation in developing countries and sort of pass by on the other side. I don't mean that rudely, because we all do as much as we can in our lives, I'm sure, to help out in that regard. But we sort of pass by because we don't really mobilize in the way that would actually change things. And a pile of bodies in the developed world is different. So, Hurricane Sandy. That's an amazing story. Presidential election campaign, as far as anyone can tell, going back over the whole span of that election, not one formal reference to climate change whatsoever. Not one. Not one. Hurricane Sandy, Michael Bloomberg suddenly says, this is really quite important, you may have missed it up until now, not your fault, because we've got two candidates who can't quite say the words. Suddenly Michael Bloomberg comes out, and there's Obama immediately after the election saying climate change is really as important as we all thought it was, and how focused he's now going to be in his second term on dealing with it. Hurricane Sandy has changed the mind of citizens in New York in ways you can't imagine. We have an office in New York, and it's fascinating talking to my colleagues that just one climatological nightmare of that kind, which is not necessarily linked to climate change, but increasingly, in the minds of people, weird weather is now linked to climate change. Americans now talk about the weather as much as we do in Britain. This is a cultural outrage. I mean, we were unique in our ability to yabba, 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 yabba about weather endlessly. And it was quite a relief to go to America and not to have to mention the weather once. Now, if you're in America, they're just as bad as we are. And it's all because of weirding weather. And guess what? Even Fox News has started to link weather and climate. This is amazing. This is amazing. I mean, if Fox News can do it, think of what universities could do if they really got at it. Just think of that. So my feeling is that still, we're not at the point yet where this is sufficiently painful to politicians to induce an accelerated change process, but it's building and building. So I guess the real story is, just enjoy this horrendous paradox for a moment, is we need the maximum amount of climate-induced pain in the system in the shortest possible period of time to avoid the runaway and irreversible stuff that I was talking about. That's very hard to get one's head around. I find that really difficult. But I've sort of ended up thinking about the future as in, how quickly can these climate disasters work their way into the benighted brains of our politicians so that actually they begin to see what this really means? Probably in economic terms, because that's the thing that will actually change them. Two more. Well, there was a lady just there, and then I think there's a gentleman in the front here. I'm really sorry.
Microphone.
Sorry.
I said, I've actually got the microphone. So.
I beg your pardon. Thank you. You go for it. That's power for you.
My point is that do you not think it's beyond the capability of politicians to manage this situation, and it has to be led by us, the populace?
I don't know. I still think I'd still rather be trying to make this work in a democracy than in an autocracy. I mentioned China with praise a minute ago, but you will know that China is a pretty mixed and uncomfortable story. There are a lot of things going on in China that are unlikely to work in terms of how we see the world and how we would want the world to be for young people today. And actually, I think China's going to move faster on many of these issues on climate change than the West is. I'm sorry to tell you that, but China's got the message that the global environmental goods and services sector is a multi-trillion-dollar sector growing so fast that the nation that commands the biggest share of that sector stands to benefit massively. We haven't quite internalized this yet. We talk about the green economy, but we don't think in terms of trillions of dollars of new economic value being created. China has a plan for its percentage share of the low-carbon environmental goods and services sector, what share they will have by 2020, 2030, 2040. China isn't really a country. China is a civilization. And what that sort of means is that they don't think like we do. They don't think in spans of pathetic political time, you know, how much time you've got in office. They think long term, and this is both good for the world and scary for the world. So my own residual faith is that democracies are still capable of doing this. And I would just hate to think that we reach the point where democracy could no longer deliver a socially just, compassionate, and sustainable world. That would be a shocking moment of truth. So I'm hanging in there with democracy, and I'm wedded to the idea that politicians are not irreversibly stupid, and that we have a possibility of educating and nurturing the next generation of politicians so that these things become easier. They're never going to be easy. Look at the scale of the challenge. It's never going to be easy. So that's where I am at the moment, and I hope I never depart from that view. I really do. There's a question down the front here. Oh, you've got it back. Well done. Well done. Okay, so should we take these? Let's take these two together, and then I'll wrap up both. I hope your two questions are in roughly the same territory then.
I don't know. We will see. My question is a bit about your beginning of your lecture. By the way, thank you very much for your lecture. I think there's quite thought-provoking, but you started quite optimistic, that you are hopeful for the future. And you mentioned now twice, quite positively, China. I disagree with your assessment of China because, well, they open a nuclear power station or coal power station nearly every week. So they are consuming a lot of energy, an increasingly amount of energy every year, more and more. And they are producing the next outcome of the Industrial Revolution. It happens in China. And so I'm a bit more pessimistic. Yeah. And I think the only way to change it is education. Education. And I think this is the only way how we can change, and not by looking at China or United States.
Okay.
Yeah.
Actually, a little bit ironically, it does.
Thank you as well for your lecture. It was stimulating. The mixed message, I'm not talking about Rodri Morgan and climate change and the impacts on Wales, but you were quoted on the World Bank in 2000. The New York Times reported in 2010 that they had lent more money, World Bank had lent more money to Asia to build coal-fired power stations than to the GEF. So these sort of environmental versus...
Yep, gotcha. World Bank, China, solution, problem. So look, this is a world in transition. Expect horrendous grinding of political gears as we move from one world to the next. It is inevitable we will move from this world to this zero hydrocarbon world. It's inevitable. It will either happen because we plan it and make it happen intelligently, compassionately, or it will happen because we find that it is forced upon us. So it's going to happen. And as this change happens, you can imagine as we give up on a paradigm of progress that is quite deep in our genetic being now, moving away from that is problematic. So we're going to see all these kind of mixed messages and ambivalence and what I sort of cognitive dissonance, as psychologists call it, holding two incompatible realities in your brain at the same time and not noticing. We're going to see all of this stuff really going on for quite a long time, and it is hugely frustrating. I'm certainly not going to defend the World Bank here this evening. When that happens in my life, I'll know that it's a sort of time probably to hang up my campaigning boots, as it were. But the World Bank in 2012 actually invested more in renewable energy than it did in fossil fuels. So it is changing. That's all I'm going to say about the World Bank. China, what can I say? You're right. And of course, I hope China isn't building one nuclear power station every week, by the way. They are still, that would be seriously problematic. They do have 6 new nuclear power stations under construction at the moment. And it will be a big part of China's future energy mix. That is true. China is still building new coal-fired power stations. That is true. But what you never hear about in the West, because it doesn't suit us, is that China is closing more coal-fired power stations than it is building. And it's actually getting rid of the most inefficient power stations to build new, more efficient coal-fired power stations. An improvement of sorts. But just think about this from a social justice perspective for a moment, coming back to this. 1.3 billion people, 450 million of whom still live in a state of poverty, which most people in this room would barely be able to conceptualize. Mostly in rural China, but increasingly in urban poor cadre in China as well. And China has done a better job bringing its poor people out of poverty in a shorter period of time than any nation has ever done in the history of humankind. And you sort of have to acknowledge that, because sustainability, which depends on keeping people in poverty, isn't really sustainability as we should be thinking about it. So what China is doing is saying we're still a very poor nation. It may not look like it out there, but 450 million people live lives of misery. And we're going to do something about it. And yes, right now that means building more coal-fired power stations. But at the same time, China is investing massively in renewable energy. You can hardly believe the amount of new wind turbines going up in China. Unfortunately, they haven't connected them to the grid yet, because most of the places where there's lots of wind in China are out in these sort of deserts. They're building huge, huge wind farms, even bigger than the wind farms in Wales, even bigger, out there in China. But they haven't thought about grid connectivity, which is a bit of a shame. But eventually, China will get on top of this renewable energy story. Out of the 7 Chinese leaders now, there used to be 9, I think there are 7 now, maybe even 6, 5 of them are engineers and scientists. 5 of them. That means they understand something called the laws of thermodynamics. I would die to be living in a democracy where even 10% of our politicians could actually sort of be curious enough, even if they're not scientists, be curious enough to get to grips with the laws of thermodynamics. That would be brilliant, a state of enlightenment. And my last comment, if I may, I know we've got to shut up now. I've got to shut up, sorry, not we. I've got to shut up, is about education in China. Do not underestimate what is going on in Chinese universities today. You may think sustainability is only thriving here in Trinity St. David. I tell you, sustainability in Chinese universities is alive and well and growing and creative. So you guess which country is taking the largest number of students per head of population, otherwise it's a cheat, obviously, in China, with 1.3 billion people, but per head of population, you tell me which country is educating more students in what they call the circular economy or the closed-loop economy in their mainstream economic faculties and universities in the world today. It is China, by a million miles. China has courses on the circular economy in so many universities you can hardly count it. Why? Because they know that the existing economic model is busted. They know it. And as engineers, they sort of know they'd better address it quick. They call it the closed-loop economy, circular economy, call it what you will. We haven't even begun to articulate what that would mean for our economy. So you're right. Education is the answer, but not just education in Wales, education in China too. Thank you.
So you've been challenged, and we're bringing this to an end because there is also a very special chapel evensong, and there are a number of people in the audience here who'll be going on to that. But I think that it's appropriate that we have the president of our students' union, a Lampeter student, to respond to what Jonathan has just said to us. Matthias.
Thank you very much, Jane. Don't worry, I've never heard of me either. I just wanted to thank Jonathan for a very brilliant lecture, a very insightful, very thought-provoking lecture. And thank you for joining us here in Lampeter on St. David's Day. Thank you very much. I also want to thank the people I'm responsible for and the people I answer to, my bosses, the students, because it's the students that are making this happen. And it's the students that are making it happen in Lampeter and in Trinity St. David as a whole. We have had a very successful week in Trinity St. David, as Jane mentioned earlier. But none of it would have been possible if it wasn't for the students. We've done some fantastic work already. One of my favorite successes of last year was the Rooting for Change program, when we planted trees and built links with Bore, a community in Kenya. And, excuse me, that happened. And we can do it. We can do this. And there's a wonderful story as well connected to the Rooting for Change program, which was that when we put forward our ideas to a certain member of the senior management team, I won't mention names. Don't worry, Vice Chancellor, it wasn't you. And they said, how much do you want to raise? How much do you want to raise for this project? And we said £1,200. And they said, well, how much are you realistically going to raise? And we said £1,200. And we did. In fact, we smashed £1,200. And the university match funded us pound for pound on that project. So to all those students who keep inspiring us and keep being inspired, I just want to say a massive thank you. And please keep this agenda alive and well. And if we do that, we can make change happen. Thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr.
Thank you so much, Matthias, and thank you so much for coming with us to London to share in the award ceremony, because the award was for the whole university, for the staff, for the students, for the governors, and I'm delighted we have our president here with us today as well. Thank you all for coming. It's lovely to see the Mayor of Lampeter. It's lovely to see people from Ceredigion County Council. There are a number of people here from the town. This is the beginning of a new engagement in the context of sustainability between the university and the surrounding area. And I look forward to this, the first Inspire lecture, being replicated for the future. And I just want to leave you with my best quote of the day. I love quotes, and this one comes from Peter Harper from CAT, and his quote was, "Failure is the compost of success." So, Jonathan, we have failed, as a generation, but let that be the compost for the success of the new endeavour here in West Wales. Diolch yn fawr iawn i chi gyd. Thank you very much indeed.